In the winter of 1996, a Welsh miner named Gareth Powell walked into the night shift and never walked out. His name was marked on the roster. His boots were seen at the lamp room, but no one could say where he vanished underground. Officials called it an accident, a tragedy buried in stone. The mine reopened within days. Families were told to move on. But in the company's own files, inspectors had already warned of gas buildups and failing alarms. Those papers were hidden, locked away. 20 years later, a sealed box emerged in a county archive. Memos, altered signatures, and one metal lunch tin, battered and ordinary, stamped with Gareth's initials. It forced the story open again, revealing not only how he disappeared, but why silence had followed. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from today. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. The valley was a place of habit, a place where every day followed a rhythm set by the mine. South Wales had lived under that rhythm for more than a century. By 1996, the old collieries were fewer, but the sound of machinery still defined the hills. Each morning the siren cut across the mist, and each evening headlights climbed the narrow roads as men in dust-marked overalls returned to their families. That winter was colder than most. Frost clung to slate rooftops. Smoke curled from chimneys into air that refused to move. The hills looked skeletal under pale sky, bare trees etched against a horizon of stone. At night, the pubs filled with men trading small talk, and the roads fell silent except for boots on pavement heading to the late shift. It was on one of those nights that Gareth Powell walked out of his door carrying the same brass lunch tin he had carried for years. Gareth was 38, a miner since his teens, known in the valley as reliable, steady, never one to make trouble. His wife, Elin, packed his tin with sandwiches and a flask of tea. Their 2 children were asleep when he left. She kissed him once at the door and told him not to be late. The brass tin caught the faint glow of the streetlight as he stepped away. Neighbors saw him on the road. One, Mrs. Llewellyn, recalled later that he raised his hand in greeting. Another, Dylan Reese, who worked the same shift, said Gareth joked about the cold biting worse than the dust. They walked part of the road together, past the terraced rows and down toward the gates. It was 10 p.m. when they reached the lamp room. Inside, the routine was mechanical. Miners checked helmets, collected lamps, and signed the roster. Gareth's name was written clearly at 10:03 p.m. He hung his coat on the hook, nodded to the clerk, and walked into the cage with half a dozen others. The steel doors clanged shut. The cage dropped into the shaft, echoing like a bell into darkness. At the end of that shift, the cage rose again, bringing men back to the surface. Gareth was not among them. His co-workers said they last saw him walking toward the western tunnels. Supervisors initiated a sweep, calling his name, tapping the walls with steel rods, listening for any response. They found nothing. By mid-morning, word reached the town. The manager released a short statement at the gate. "We regret to confirm a tragic accident has occurred during last night's operations. Our search continues." He gave no detail, no body, no explanation. Families pressed for answers, but the gates stayed shut. Detective Inspector Rhys Morgan was dispatched after Elin insisted her husband's disappearance was no accident. Rhys was not new to industrial investigations. He had seen collapses, gas leaks, machinery failures. But he was struck by the gaps in the story. A man could be killed underground. Yes. A man could be buried beyond recovery. Yes. But a man could not vanish entirely without leaving a trace. Rhys entered the lamp room with 2 constables. On the wall hung a line of coats, helmets, and boots. Gareth's coat was there, his boots still caked with mud from the road. On the table sat his brass tin, returned hours earlier, sandwiches untouched, flask still holding lukewarm tea. The clerk said it had been left in the cage on the surface, though no one remembered Gareth coming up. The roster showed his signature, neat and unmistakable, but beneath his name was a gap in the column. Other names appeared out of order, filled later. Rhys noted the irregularity, tapping his pen against the page. "Why the gap?" he asked. The clerk gave a shrug. Records were sometimes messy, but not like this. That evening, Elin stood outside the gate holding the tin. She refused to go home without answers. Families gathered around her, whispering about faulty alarms, about gas monitors ignored. Some spoke of meetings where miners raised concerns only to be told to keep silent. One man muttered that the company had more lawyers than engineers these days. The rumors thickened as the mist rolled down from the hills. In the pub that night, men drank without laughter. Dylan Reese told Reese quietly that he remembered an alarm flicker in the western tunnel before Gareth turned down that way. The alarm was dismissed by the foreman. "Just a sensor glitch," he had said. Dylan admitted he hadn't thought about it since, until now. Later, as Reese sat in his car, he opened a narrow notebook he always carried. He wrote slowly, in tight script that caught the lamplight. Body missing, tin present, roster incomplete, alarms questioned. Then he shut the book and slipped it back into his coat. The next morning, the company posted guards at the gate. Families were told no one could enter without clearance. The official search was concluded. No remains, no equipment, no explanation. The shaft reopened for work the following day. Elin carried the tin home and placed it on the kitchen table. She left it there, lid closed, sandwiches still inside. The object became heavier with every hour of silence, as though it carried the weight of her husband's absence. Reese drove out of the valley as night fell again. He passed the rows of houses where curtains twitched, past the roadside shrines where candles flickered. He did not turn on the radio. He thought only of the roster, the gap in the column, the tin in Elin's hands. He wrote one more note before closing his book. Something hidden. Behind him, the mine gates locked shut, and mist swallowed the steel. His tin was logged, but his body never surfaced. The morning after the announcement, the town was restless. Curtains twitched as company cars rolled through the narrow streets. The mine gates remained closed, guarded by two men in reflective jackets who said nothing to anyone who approached. Families clustered in small groups at the roadside, some clutching thermoses, others just their coats pulled tight against the cold. The name everyone whispered was the same, Gareth. Elin stood among them, her children beside her, the brass lunch tin clutched against her chest. She had not unpacked it. Neighbors offered words of comfort, but none reached her. "He was a careful man," she told anyone who asked. "He wouldn't just walk into danger." Her voice trembled more with anger than with grief. By midday, the company executives arrived, their dark cars parked by the gates, tires crunching on frost. The manager, a man named Mr. Henshaw, stepped forward with a sheet of paper in his hand. He read from it flatly. The search had yielded no remains, but all safety procedures had been followed. There was no threat to other workers, no danger to the community. Work would resume that evening. The crowd murmured, but no one shouted. These were families who depended on the mine. Rent, heat, school fees, all of it tied to wages paid by the company. Yet beneath the silence lay something raw: disbelief. The men who had worked alongside Gareth knew how the tunnels smelled before a gas leak, how the lamps flickered when the air turned wrong. They had spoken of it for weeks. Reese Morgan stood at the edge of the gathering, his notebook in his pocket. He watched Henshaw's expressionless delivery, his eyes darting only when questions pressed too close. Later, Reese approached the union representative, Owain Hughes, a stocky man with coal-blackened fingernails and deep lines across his brow. "You've had complaints," Reese said. Hughes looked down at the ground. "We've had warnings," he replied, "but nothing they ever put in writing." That was not entirely true. In the back room of the union office, Hughes pulled a folder from beneath a stack of newspapers. Inside was a copy of a safety audit marked confidential, dated only weeks earlier. It listed failing sensors, rusting ventilation shafts, and pressure irregularities. At the bottom was a note: immediate remedial action required. But the final page, the recommendations, was missing. Torn clean away. Reese handled the sheet carefully, his breath showing in the cold air. The absence of that page was louder than the words still present. Someone had removed it deliberately. That night, Elin placed the lunch tin in the center of the kitchen table and lit a candle beside it. Her children ate silently, eyes fixed on the brass surface. She did not touch the food inside, not yet. The tin had become more than an object. It was proof that Gareth had walked into the mine and not walked out. Neighbors dropped by in ones and twos. Some brought bread, others only stood awkwardly by the door. One older miner, Evan Lloyd, whispered to Reese before leaving, "The alarm's down there. They've been covered with tape. We all know it." His eyes darted nervously as though the walls themselves could report his words. In the small hours, Reese spread the audit across his desk. He copied the heading into his notebook. Audit 1496, confidential. He stared at the torn edge where the last page should have been. He wrote, "Page removed. Deliberate concealment likely." Then he underlined it twice. The next morning, frost coated the windows so thickly it blurred the view of the hills. At the gates, work resumed as if nothing had happened. New rosters were posted, new names filled the columns. Families went home, but none believed the story was finished. Inside her house, Elin kept the tin on the table. The sandwiches were curling at the edges, the bread stiff, but she could not bring herself to throw them away. She looked at the dent on one corner and traced it with her thumb until her skin ached. Reese closed his notebook and looked out at the valley. He had seen men die in mines before, but never had he seen a company so quick to erase the missing. The words of the manager echoed, "No danger to the community." He knew then that what had happened to Gareth was more than an accident. The audit's final page was ripped clean away. The following week, the valley seemed quieter than usual, as though the hills themselves had withdrawn into silence. Smoke still curled from chimneys. The pubs still filled at night. But conversation dropped when anyone mentioned the mine. The official story, that Gareth Powell had been lost to a sudden accident, sat heavily on everyone's tongue, yet no one fully believed it. Detective Reese Morgan returned to the site daily, each time facing the same guarded expressions from company staff. Files were withheld, access delayed, corridors locked with chains that had not been there before. The words, "confidential investigation," were spoken so often they lost all meaning. Reese pressed anyway, asking about alarms, about equipment logs, about the missing page from the safety audit. Each request was met with a smile that did not reach the eyes. Late one afternoon, in a dim corner of the union office, Owain Hughes leaned closer. "You want answers?" he muttered. "Then you'll need to find Dylan Reese." Dylan had been on the same shift as Gareth, and while he had spoken briefly before, Reese sensed there was more. That evening he tracked him down at the Black Swan pub. Dylan sat hunched over a pint, coal dust still smudging his fingernails, though he hadn't worked in days. When Reese pressed him, Dylan finally admitted he had seen Gareth pause near the western tunnels. "He stopped to talk to the foreman," Dylan said quietly. "I couldn't hear, but Gareth didn't look happy. He pointed at the monitors. I kept walking. That was the last I saw." Reese asked for the foreman's name. Dylan shook his head. "It won't matter. That notebook's gone now." The words slipped out before he realized what he had said. Reese leaned in. "What notebook?" Dylan hesitated, then whispered, "The foreman always carried a small book. He wrote down the readings. If Gareth argued about the alarms, it'll be in there. But no one's seen it since." 2 nights later, a miner's wife appeared at Elin's door holding a torn sheet of paper. She said her husband had found it wedged behind a locker in the changing room. It was a fragment of the foreman's notebook. Numbers ran down the page. Gas levels, pressures, columns of figures smudged by graphite. Across the bottom edge, the paper had been ripped, the rest gone. Elin passed the sheet to Reese, her hands trembling. The detective studied the figures under lamplight. They were higher than normal, dangerously so. If accurate, they meant Gareth had gone into a tunnel already primed for disaster. The fragment was logged as evidence, sealed in a clear envelope. That night, Elin returned to the kitchen table. The brass tin remained in its place, the sandwiches long spoiled. She lifted the lid, touched the curled bread, then closed it again with a hollow click. She could not bring herself to throw anything away. The tin had become a weight that tethered Gareth's absence to the house. Reese, meanwhile, carried the envelope back to his desk. He wrote carefully in his notebook, capturing the sequence. Gareth enters shaft at 10:3 p.m. Scene near Western Tunnels. Confronts foreman. Foreman's notebook missing. Fragment found. Gas levels above safety threshold. The words hardened into a pattern. There had been a warning, recorded in graphite, now scattered and half-hidden. He imagined Gareth pointing at the monitors, demanding an answer, his voice lost in the roar of machinery. And then nothing. Days passed, and the company pushed forward. Executives gave statements to the press, repeating phrases about safety standards and isolated incidents. They avoided mentioning Gareth by name. In town, men whispered more openly, of threats made to those who spoke, of shifts signed off though not worked, of alarms taped to silence. The rumors grew teeth. Elin attended a Sunday service where the vicar spoke of resilience and faith. Afterward, women gathered around her, touching her arm, glancing at the tin she carried even into the church. It had become a symbol not only of Gareth's absence, but of all their fears. They knew that if one man could vanish, so could any of them. That evening, Rhys stood outside the mine gates again. The air was sharp with frost, his breath white. He thought of the torn page, the missing notebook, and the silence of men who knew too much. He understood then that this was not only about one disappearance, it was about a system that valued silence more than truth. In the distance, the lamps of the mine glowed faintly, their light hazy in the mist. Somewhere beneath that glow, in the darkness of the tunnels, answers waited. Numbers smeared in graphite hinted at something lethal below. Snow came early to the valley, settling in the seams of slate roofs and covering the slag heaps in pale silence. The mine kept running, its sirens blaring each morning, as though nothing had changed. Men still descended, lamps swinging in the dark, but every step carried the weight of Gareth Powell's absence. At the pubs, voices dropped when his name was spoken. At the chapel, his children sat stiff beside their mother, staring at the brass tin she carried in her bag. Detective Rhys Morgan worked steadily, pressing for records. Company officials granted him access only to files that proved nothing. Maintenance schedules neatly signed, equipment checklists that gleamed with order. But Rhys noticed patterns, dates that did not align, pages inserted too cleanly, ink too fresh. He knew when a file had been touched. The county records office became his refuge. Its stone walls sweated cold. Its shelves groaned with dust. He requested access to the mine's compliance history, documents stretching back decades. A clerk led him to reels of microfilm, their spools labeled with numbers worn from years of handling. Under the magnifier's dim glow, Rhys rolled through page after page, citations for faulty ventilation, notes on collapsed supports, warnings about gas detection. Each reel ended with signatures declaring the matter resolved. Yet when he cross-checked against physical binders, whole sections were missing. On one reel, dated 3 years before Gareth's disappearance, he found a line in the margin. Repeat issue, alarms disengaged. The handwriting was hurried, the ink smudged, as though the inspector had written quickly before the page was sealed. That reel's corresponding binder was nowhere in the archive. The clerk shook his head. Lost in transfer, he said. Rhys wrote in his notebook, lost or taken. Back in town, he visited Elin. She had set the brass tin on the mantel, above the cold fireplace. Snowlight from the window made the dent on its corner glint like a wound. It was his every day, she told Rhys. Never once did he leave without it. Her voice was steady, but her hands twisted in her lap. Now it feels heavier than stone. She brought out a photograph from a drawer. It showed Gareth on the hillside with his workmates, the tin resting in his lap. The image was time-stamped, 1 week before he vanished. Behind him in the frame, the mouth of the shaft loomed, its shadows reaching even in daylight. Rhys studied the photograph, tracing the lines of the tin, then the darkness of the shaft. The contrast was stark, an ordinary object against the abyss. At the pub that evening, men whispered about Rhys's presence. Some avoided his gaze, Others offered small nods of encouragement. One older miner, Evan Lloyd, spoke after 2 drinks. "You want truth? Look in the records before they vanish. We've seen it before. Warnings written, then gone the next week. The paper doesn't last long when profit's at stake." That night, Reese returned to his desk, spreading photographs, fragments, and notes across the table. He pinned the image of Gareth with his tin beside the audit sheet, the torn notebook page, and his own scribbled lines. Together, they formed a mosaic of silence. Missing pages, missing men, missing accountability. The following morning, a courier arrived at the station with an envelope marked "Anonymous." Inside was a single photocopied sheet, an older audit summary. Across its surface were columns of figures, but one line stood out. "Methane levels exceed threshold. Recommend immediate halt of operations." Beneath the recommendation was a scrawl. "Overruled. Henshaw." The signature was faint but legible. Reese leaned back, staring at the page. It was not proof yet, but it was a thread. Someone inside the system wanted him to pull it. He logged the sheet carefully, sliding it into an evidence sleeve. That evening, the snow thickened. Street lamps glowed like smudges in the fog. Elin lit candles in her kitchen and set the tin beside them, its brass reflecting wavering light. Outside, the valley slept uneasily, as though the land itself knew secrets buried in its veins. Reese sat at his desk long past midnight. He played the reel of microfilm again, the inspector's rushed handwriting flickering on the screen. He compared it with the anonymous photocopy. Both spoke of alarms ignored, warnings buried. Both carried the same smell of fear. He wrote one line in his notebook before closing it. The shaft behind him was always darker than it seemed. In the photo, the tin gleamed, but the shaft behind was dark. The valley held its breath as January began. Snow melted into gray slush along the cobbled streets, but the air remained bitter. Each morning, the siren blared at the mine gates, pulling men back underground. For the families who had gathered during the search, life seemed to resume. Yet, an unease lingered in every glance, every pause in conversation. Gareth Powell's absence was not forgotten. It was buried, the way coal dust clung to lungs, unseen but heavy. Detective Reese Morgan's investigation pressed deeper. He had submitted formal requests for internal documents, but the company responded with rehearsed politeness and little else. Still, someone inside was leaking. The anonymous photocopy had proven that. He suspected there was more, someone ready to speak, but afraid of the cost. It was Owen Hughes, the union representative, who made the next move. He met Reese in the dim back room of the miners' welfare hall, where the smell of stale smoke lingered. Owen's face was drawn, his jaw tight. He slid an envelope across the table, its corners darkened with grease. "I shouldn't have this," he muttered. "If they find out, it's my job. Maybe worse." Inside were 3 typed memos, each bearing the company letterhead. The language was clinical, but the meaning unmistakable. One memo described abnormal methane readings in the western tunnels. Another noted that monitoring devices were disabled pending maintenance. The third, dated the very night Gareth vanished, stated, "Uncontrolled methane release in Lower West Drift. Recommend immediate suspension of activity." Across the bottom, a line of black ink had been dragged over several sentences, leaving only faint shadows of words beneath. Reese turned the paper slowly, his fingertips leaving no mark. "Where did these come from?" he asked. Owen shook his head. "Don't ask. Just know others are watching. Careful where you walk." His voice dropped further. "This valley's seen men buried for less." When Reese looked up, Owen was already gone, leaving the chair rocking behind him. That night, Elin sat alone at her kitchen table. The tin was still there, unchanged. She had not thrown away the spoiled sandwiches, though the bread had hardened, curling at the edges. She touched the lid and whispered, "They think I'll forget you." Her children slept in the next room, but she remained by the candle, the brass catching the flame in fleeting glints. The next morning, word spread that Owen had not come home. His car was found abandoned by the quarry road, door ajar, keys in the ignition. No note, no explanation. Some said he had fled under pressure. Others whispered darker things. Reese drove to the scene, frost crunching under his boots. The car sat alone, its windows iced, the driver's seat damp as though left in a hurry. On the passenger seat lay a union leaflet with Gareth's name scrawled on the margin. Reese logged the discovery carefully. He did not say the word abduction, though it pulsed through his mind. He thought instead of the envelope, of the blacked-out sentences, of the way Owain's hand had trembled. Back at his desk, Reese slid the memos into a folder marked temporary evidence. He studied the streaks of ink where words had been erased. Holding the paper to the light, he could almost trace letters beneath. Not enough to form sentences, but enough to know the message had been buried deliberately. Elin heard of Owain's disappearance that evening. She came to Reese in the station, the tin clutched in both hands. "They're taking anyone who speaks," she said. Her voice cracked, but her eyes were steady. "You can't let this stop here." Reese promised her he wouldn't. Snow began to fall again outside, soft and unrelenting, covering the roads in white silence. Reese looked through the station window, watching it gather on the sill. Somewhere beyond that quiet lay men willing to tear pages from files, black out lines, and erase people who stood in their way. On his desk, the envelope cast a faint stain, a shadow in the shape of a circle. When he brushed his hand across it, he realized it matched the lid of Gareth's tin. He stared at it until the office light flickered. The valley, once so familiar, now felt like a place where truth itself could vanish. Owain's car was found abandoned near the quarry road. By February, the valley carried an edge of dread. The snow had cleared, but the air stayed sharp, and every morning the siren dragged men back into the dark as if nothing had happened. Posters for union meetings curled on lampposts, the ink running from sleet. Gareth Powell's name had faded from the newspapers, but in the homes along the terraced rows, it was still spoken in whispers, often with the word cover-up close behind. Detective Reese Morgan kept the pressure. He filed requests with the county court for the company's internal logs, but delays piled up, replies stalled, and documents arrived redacted into near blankness. He turned instead to the rosters, the simple sheets that marked every name, every hour. It was there he found another crack. Gareth's last entry had already shown a gap beneath it, but now Reese studied other days. Signatures reappeared in the wrong ink, strokes too heavy compared to earlier samples. On two separate rosters, the same man had apparently signed in after his death. Thomas Evans, killed in a machinery collapse 2 years prior. Reese carried the papers to a forensic clerk in Cardiff. Under magnification, the ink fluoresced differently, proving it came from a modern pen, not one available in 1996. The clerk said nothing more, only handed him a report with a thin smile. The implication was chilling. Someone inside had forged men into the mine, making the rosters read as they wished. The next evening, the town hall filled for a meeting. Families crowded into the cold chamber, the smell of damp coats heavy in the air. At the front sat the company executives, led by Henshaw, stiff in his dark suit. He read again from prepared notes. Operations remain safe. All procedures continue under full compliance. We grieve for the family's loss, but evidence does not suggest negligence. Elin rose from her chair, the brass tin clutched in both hands. She stepped into the aisle, her voice steady enough to cut through the murmurs. "This came back from your lamp room," she said. "It proves he entered that shaft. Where is the rest of him?" The room fell silent. For a moment, Henshaw faltered. He looked at the tin as though it were something dangerous, not ordinary. Then he adjusted his tie and muttered, "We cannot answer speculation." The crowd stirred. Some clapped, others shouted questions, but the executives stood and walked out, their shoes echoing on the wooden floor. Elin remained standing, the tin heavy against her chest, her children watching wide-eyed from the back row. After the hall emptied, Reese approached her. "They won't admit it," he said quietly. "Not yet, but we have the rosters." He tapped the folder under his arm. "And they show more than one ghost." Later that night, he spread the evidence on his desk. Forged names, mismatched ink, and the photograph of Gareth with the tin. He copied one line into his notebook, writing slowly. One signature belonged to a dead man. The words seemed to hum in the quiet room. Elin sat at home in her kitchen. She placed the tin back on the table and rested her hand on the dented lid. She whispered Gareth's name once, then blew out the candle. The valley's silence deepened. The company tried to maintain its grip, but the cracks in the facade widened with every forged line Reese uncovered. The truth was pushing upward, like gas seeping through stone, waiting only for a spark. One signature belonged to a man already dead 2 years. March brought rain, steady and cold, washing soot down the valley streets. The miners trudged to work with collars up, lamps swinging in the drizzle. On the hillsides, rivulets ran black where coal dust bled into the streams. The town lived under a constant weight, not only of stone overhead, but of secrets pressing from beneath. Gareth Powell's name had slipped from the papers, but in the pubs, it still hung in the air, carried low and careful. Detective Reese Morgan had been following a whisper left on his desk. An anonymous call scrawled on a torn scrap of paper, Locker 12, Ridgeway Depot. The message bore no signature, only the words and a smudge of graphite. Reese drove through the rain to the storage facility on the outskirts, where corrugated metal sheds lined a gravel yard. His warrant opened the lock. Inside, the air smelled of rust and oil. Rows of crates filled the space, each stamped with the company's emblem. He pried one open. Inside lay stacks of unused respirators, their filters sealed, never issued. Another crate held methane detectors still in packaging, serial numbers matching procurement orders but never marked in distribution logs. These were the very items listed in safety audits as in service. Here they sat, untouched. On a shelf in the corner, Reese found something smaller. A battered lunch tin, dented and scuffed, not Gareth's, but unmistakably of the same kind miners carried daily. It lay among discarded helmets, its lid caved in as though struck by falling rock. He lifted it carefully, the rain drumming on the roof above. The sight of it chilled him, not because it was Gareth's, but because it bore the same wound, the same echo of a collapse pressed into brass. He photographed the find, logged the crates, and sealed the locker. Back at his office, he entered serial numbers into the ledger. None matched the distribution sheets provided by the company. The mismatch was deliberate, another layer of silence. Meanwhile, in town, Elin noticed men watching her house from parked cars. She drew the curtains tighter, but she kept the brass tin on the table, a small act of defiance. Her children asked when their father would return. She had no answer. At night, she dreamed of the tin falling down endless tunnels, dented again and again, ringing like a bell. Reese returned to the storage yard days later, but Locker 12 had been emptied. The crates were gone, the shelves bare. Only the damp outline of boxes remained on the concrete floor. He cursed under his breath, then noticed a faint smear of grease on the wall, shaped like the hinge of a tin lid. He took a photograph, adding it to his file. At the pub that night, Dylan Reese leaned close over his pint. "You shouldn't have gone there," he warned. "They know every step you take. Locker 12 was a message, not evidence. They want you chasing shadows." Reese replied evenly. "Shadows still prove there's light somewhere." Back home, he spread the photographs across his desk. Respirators sealed in plastic, detectors never touched, a dented tin lying among helmets. Each image told the same story. Safety had been locked away, hidden from the men who needed it. Gareth had walked into a tunnel stripped of its protections. Rain tapped on the window as Reese wrote a single line in his notebook. Even discarded metal remembers the weight of stone. The dent looked like a cave-in pressed into metal. By early spring, the valley carried the smell of damp earth and coal dust. Rain slipped constantly through the air, blurring the outlines of the hills. The mine roared on, its sirens as steady as clock bells, but beneath the surface of daily life, tension grew louder. The disappearance of Gareth Powell was no longer just a private wound. It had become a quiet rebellion against silence. Detective Reese Morgan now found himself shadowed. Each time he left the station, a dark sedan idled a block away. At the cafe, men he didn't know lingered too long over empty cups. Even in the chapel on Sunday, he felt eyes on him. Pressure was building, not only underground, but above it. Still, he pressed forward. A retired inspector, Malcolm Price, agreed to meet him in a churchyard. Malcolm was an old man, shoulders bent from years in tunnels, his face seamed with coal scars. He lit a cigarette with trembling fingers and exhaled slowly. "You want the truth?" he said. "Look at the air quality reports. They kept them from you, didn't they?" Reese nodded. Malcolm dropped his cigarette and crushed it under his boot. "That's because I wrote them. Methane was high for months. They told me to keep quiet. I signed off once, then I left. I couldn't keep bearing the same warning." Later that night, Reese obtained samples from the western shaft, working with a sympathetic technician. Dust was scraped from the stone, logged, and tested. The results came back sharp. Methane concentration far above safe thresholds. The technician showed him the chart, the jagged lines like a heartbeat gone wrong. Reese felt the cold settle deeper in his chest. Gareth hadn't vanished in a vacuum. He had walked into a chamber primed to kill. Meanwhile, Elin continued her vigil at home. She placed Gareth's tin beside the lab vial Reese brought to show her, two artifacts from different worlds. She stared at them as if weighing which held more truth, the brass he had carried every day, or the dust that proved the air itself had turned poisonous. To her, both spoke of absence. Both were fragments of what was lost. The press arrived soon after. National reporters stood outside the gates with cameras, their umbrellas shaking in the wind. Executives issued new statements, doubling down on their assurances. "Safety remains our top priority," Henshaw declared into microphones. "These rumors of negligence are unfounded." His words echoed hollow, bouncing off the steel gates and into the rain. Inside the station, Reese pinned the dust report beside the photograph of Gareth holding his tin. He traced the lines with his pen, linking object to element, man to atmosphere. Each clue whispered the same thing, not chance, but concealment. That evening, mist rolled low across the valley. Reese lit a lamp in his office and stared at the two items before him, the brass tin, dulled by touch, and the evidence vial, its contents hissing faintly when flame neared. One was domestic, ordinary. The other was forensic, scientific. Together, they told a single story of a man erased by a system designed to bury truth. In the distance, the mine's floodlights glowed through fog, casting halos against the rain. Beneath that glow, deeper in the tunnels, secrets lingered like gas, invisible until struck. The dust hissed when flame neared, like breath still trapped. By April, the pressure was no longer confined to whispers in pubs or folded notes slipped under doors. Court subpoenas forced the company to hand over internal files, and for the first time, Reese Morgan could see beyond the polished statements. Boxes of binders arrived at the county office, wheeled in by clerks who avoided his eyes. The executives had hoped the sheer volume would bury him, but Reese was patient. He spread the binders across long tables, page after page of safety checklists, rosters, and compliance reports. Most looked immaculate, too immaculate. Every inspection signed off, every machine serviced, every alarm tested. Yet in one binder, tucked between pages stamped routine, he found something different. A log written in smaller, hurried handwriting. It was marked Confidential, night of 12/12/96. The date was Gareth Powell's disappearance. The log described an alarm event in the Western Drift. The final entry read, "System override implemented to prevent production stoppage." Reese felt the chill of those words. Override. Someone had silenced the alarms deliberately. He copied the entry into his notebook, his pen pressing hard enough to score the paper. At the same time, a young clerk named Katrin Evans requested a private meeting. She arrived at his office with her hair damp from rain, clutching a brown folder under her coat. "They made me redact these," she whispered. Inside were photocopies of the very log he had just uncovered. Only the official version bore thick black ink where the words "System Override" had been. She had smuggled the unredacted copy out before it was destroyed. Reese logged the folder carefully, thanking her. "This won't be easy," he warned. Katrin's voice trembled. "I know, but I can't stay silent anymore." Meanwhile, Elin kept her vigil. She attended every hearing, the brass tin always in her hands. People had stopped asking why she carried it. They understood. It was both relic and demand, evidence and grief bound together. In the courtroom, jurors stared at it longer than at the files. The tin spoke in a way no paper could. The valley shifted with the news. Men gathered outside the gates, holding placards that read, "Truth for Gareth." Others feared for their jobs, whispering of layoffs and blacklists. The tension was no longer hidden. It pulsed through every street. Reese returned to his office late one night, rain streaking the window. He opened the log again, reading the damning line, "System override implemented." He thought of Gareth pointing at the monitors, the foreman's missing notebook, the torn audit page. All threads now converged here. On his desk lay the evidence sleeve with the original log, the photocopy smuggled by Katrin, and the photograph of Gareth holding his tin. Reese placed them side by side. One showed what the company wanted the world to see. The other showed what they tried to erase. The tin in the photograph gleamed faintly under the desk lamp, as if reflecting the truth they could not contain forever. In the stillness, Reese wrote a final line before closing his notebook. The alarms were not silent by accident. The log ended with a final blank line, hanging open. The summons came on a gray morning. Reese Morgan was called to the county council chamber, where executives from the company sat stiff behind polished tables. Files and memos lay stacked before them, thick as walls. At the center was Howard Price, site manager of the mine, a man who had built his reputation on steady control. His eyes followed Reese across the room with cold detachment. The session opened with procedural questions, but Reese was ready. He laid down the evidence, the audit sheets missing their final page, the torn fragment from the foreman's notebook, the crates of unused safety gear, the forged signatures, and finally, the unredacted log showing the words "System Override Implemented." Each piece stacked like stone, forming a structure no statement could topple. Howard Price remained composed, hands folded. But when Reese placed the tape recorder on the table, the silence shifted. The device clicked on, and Price's own voice filled the room. Weeks earlier, under quiet questioning, he had spoken words now preserved on magnetic tape. "We shut the alarms down. Production targets mattered more. I told them we could lose a man. They told me to keep the shift running." Gasps rippled through the chamber. Price's face drained of color, his jaw tightening. The executives shifted uneasily, but no one spoke. Reese let the tape run until the end, where the click of the recorder seemed louder than any testimony. Back at his office, Reese replayed the tape alone. The voice was calm, almost resigned. It was the sound of a man trapped between obedience and guilt. Price had not spoken to save himself. He had spoken because the weight of silence had become unbearable. That night, Reese returned to the valley. Elin was waiting at her kitchen table, the brass tin before her, candlelight flickering across its dented lid. He set the recorder beside it. "He admitted it," Reese said. "They silenced the alarms. They knew." Elin's hands trembled, but she did not weep. She only touched the tin, as if to ground herself against the surge of truth. In his notebook, Reese wrote slowly. Price confessed. Alarms overridden, targets prioritized, life expendable. The words sat heavy, final. He closed the cover and left it on his desk. Outside, rain lashed against the windows, harder than before. The valley seemed to echo with the sound of the tape, its truth impossible to contain. For the first time, the silence of the mine was broken, not by collapse, not by accident, but by admission. The tape clicked off, leaving the room hollow with silence. The trial opened in early summer. The courthouse steps crowded with reporters and townsfolk alike. Camera flashes cut through the drizzle, their glare bouncing off wet stone. For the valley, this was no longer just about Gareth Powell. It was about every man who had descended into the dark, knowing the alarms could be muted. Every family who had trusted the company's words more than the evidence in front of their eyes. Inside the courtroom, the air was tense. the benches filled. At the prosecution's table, files were stacked in ordered rows, audit sheets, falsified rosters, procurement records, the smuggled log. Each document was a shard of the silence that had wrapped the mine. Elin entered quietly, dressed in black, the brass lunch tin in her hands. The scrape of its handle against wood echoed in the chamber as she set it before her. Jurors glanced at it almost involuntarily, their eyes drawn to its dented lid. The object had become something more than personal. It was the symbol of everything concealed. When she took the stand, Elin held the tin in her lap. Her voice did not waver. "He carried this every day," she said. "It came home without him. That was all I was given." She lifted the lid slightly, showing the curled remnants of bread inside. The room was utterly silent. For the jurors, it was not statistics or technical reports that struck hardest, but the ordinary tin that bore the weight of absence. The prosecution unfolded its case methodically. First came the forged signatures, ink analysis proving names entered long after their bearers had died. Then the crates of unused respirators, sealed and hidden in lockers while men worked unprotected. Then the audit sheets, page after page, torn or redacted. Finally, the logbook, the unredacted version smuggled by Katrin Evans, its line about system override now entered into evidence. And then came the tape. Price's deposition was played aloud, his voice flat but damning. "We shut the alarms down. Production targets mattered more." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Jurors leaned forward, their eyes narrowing. The defense tried to argue coercion, but Price himself sat at the defense table, head bowed, his silence confirming more than any denial could. Reese sat in the gallery, notebook closed for once. His work had reached this point. The rest belonged to the court. Yet he could not look away from Elin and the tin in her lap. He knew evidence could be forged, testimony twisted, but symbols spoke differently. They lived in memory, in sight, in silence. Days stretched into weeks. Witnesses testified to faulty alarms, to warnings buried. Experts confirmed the methane levels. Each revelation chipped away at the facade until only one truth remained. Gareth Powell had been sacrificed to keep the shafts open. His disappearance treated as an inconvenience rather than a loss. On the final day, as closing statements echoed through the hall, Elin rose again, holding the tin high for the jurors to see. The dent glinted under the fluorescent lights. She said nothing. She did not need to. When the jury retired, they carried not only files and transcripts, but the image of the tin pressed into their minds. They returned faster than anyone expected. 12 jurors stared at the tin longer than the memos. The verdict was delivered on a heavy afternoon, the sky low and bruised above the courthouse. Crowds gathered along the steps, umbrellas tilted against drizzle, waiting for news that felt larger than one man's fate. Inside, the jury filed back into their box, eyes lowered until the foreman stood. The silence stretched like wire. "Guilty," he said, his voice steady. "Guilty on charges of negligence, falsification of safety records, and deliberate suppression of hazard warnings. Guilty for the system that turned alarms into silence, warnings into waste paper, and men into expendable entries on a ledger." The executives sat rigid, their suits dark against the wood paneling. One clenched his jaw, another dropped his gaze to the floor. Howard Price barely moved, the confession on tape already sealing his part in the story. Sentences were read, years, not months. For once, paper carried weight equal to stone. Elin sat at the front, the brass tin resting on her lap. She did not cry when the words were spoken. She only held the tin tighter, as if shielding it from the echoes of the chamber. When the gavel fell, she rose quietly and walked out, past the reporters, past the umbrellas, past the flashing cameras. That evening, she returned to the hillside above the shaft. The mine lay silent, its floodlights pale against the rain. At the memorial stone erected for the fallen, she placed the tin down gently, the dented lid facing the ground. She stood in the drizzle for a long time before walking away, her hands finally empty. Reese Morgan filed his final report that week. He listed every artifact entered into evidence: the torn audit, the forged rosters, the blacked-out memos, the smuggled log, the deposition tape. Item 47 on the list was the brass lunch tin. In the sterile language of the exhibit ledger, it was recorded simply as tin, dented, contents perishable. But to Rees, it carried more weight than all the rest combined. It was the story distilled into metal, ordinary, enduring, impossible to silence. The valley adjusted slowly. Men returned to work, now with respirators distributed, alarms tested under government order. The pubs grew louder again, though never quite as careless. On Sundays, the chapel pews filled. Candles lit for those lost not to accident, but to neglect. Gareth Powell's name remained among them, spoken in hymns, carried in silence. Rees visited the memorial once more. Rain streaked down the stone, dripping onto the tin where it rested. The brass had dulled, its surface spotted by weather. But in the sheen of rain, it caught a glimmer, reflecting not faces or hills, but only the empty shaft below. The case was solved. Justice, in its way, had been done. Yet the echo remained, whispering through the valley like a draft through stone. The rain turned tin to mirror, reflecting only the empty shaft.